You knew who my father was. I knew who you were the moment you dropped that wine glass, the steadiest hands in the room, and they shook only when Derek Whitmore said your name. Why did you wait 3 weeks to tell me? Because I needed you to trust me before you understood why you shouldn't. 3 marriage proposals in 11 days. That was the rumor that followed Wonwoo Yoo through the fish market stalls of Gyeongju that winter, and every one of them was a lie. What actually happened was slower, stranger, and far more dangerous than any of the vendors whispering over their morning catch could have known. The woman at the center of it was Selma Drake, 35 years old, a solar panel installer from Atlanta who had traveled 7,000 miles to disappear. The man who found her anyway was 25, owned a frame and shipping company, the kind that moved art for collectors who preferred their acquisitions undocumented. She had witnessed what happened to people who asked too many questions about powerful men. He had built a fortune helping those men keep their secrets. And in 14 months, both of them would stand before 300 guests at an ancestral memorial ceremony, watching the truth surface in a way neither of them could stop. How do you learn to trust someone whose entire life is built on the careful movement of things that were never meant to be found? Stay with this one. The wine she spilled on a guest's jacket at that banquet in Seoul is only the beginning. The firing that followed, the humiliation Derek Whitmore engineered in front of a room full of wealthy guests, that was the easy part. What comes next will cost her the name she has been hiding behind for over a decade. And it will cost him the carefully constructed distance he keeps between himself and his own warehouses. This story does not end the way you think it will. The revenge she wants is not the revenge she takes. And the ceremony meant to honor his family's legacy will become something else entirely, once she recognizes the playbook being used against the judge who holds everything in the balance. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me which part hit you the hardest. It genuinely means something to know this reached the right person. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. And I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for staying until the very end. I will see you in the next one. What would you have done if the man who finally saw you was also the one most capable of destroying everything you had built to stay hidden? 3 weeks before she learned his name, Selma Drake stood in a service corridor of the Grand Hyatt Seoul with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, counting backward from 60. She was 35 years old, 5'9", born in Charleston and rebuilt in Atlanta. Solar panel installer by trade, which meant she had spent the last 11 years on rooftops in Georgia heat, calibrating angles and running conduit while white men in polos asked if she was sure she knew what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had always known exactly what she was doing. That was the problem with working banquet service on the side. The precision that made her valuable on a roof made her dangerous with a tray. The corridor smelled like industrial soap and reheated lamb. Through the double doors, she could hear the murmur of the Hwang Foundation's annual donor banquet. 200 guests at $400,000 won a plate. The kind of money that bought silence and discretion and the assumption that the woman refilling your water glass did not have a life outside this room. Selma opened her eyes at 14. She had been in Seoul for 9 months, long enough to learn the rhythms of a city that did not ask where she came from. Long enough to stop flinching when someone said her name. She picked up her tray and pushed through the doors. The ballroom was gold and cream, chandeliers throwing fractured light across tables set with more silverware than any meal required. Selma moved along the perimeter, refilling wine glasses with the careful economy of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She had done this 47 times in the last 4 months. She knew where the server's station was, knew which guests would ignore her, and which would make eye contact just long enough to feel progressive about it. She did not know the man at table 14. He was younger than most of the donors, mid-20s at most, in a dark suit that fit like it had been cut specifically for the width of his shoulders. He sat at the edge of his table's conversation, turning a water glass slowly between his fingers while the older men beside him argued about shipping tariffs. His face was still in a way that made Selma think of courthouse witnesses, the ones who had learned to give nothing away. She moved past him without pausing. His eyes followed her for exactly 3 seconds. She felt it the way you feel someone watching from a rooftop across the street, that prickle at the back of the neck that says you have been measured and filed away. Derek Whitmore found her at the server's station 11 minutes later. He was the banquet manager, American, mid-40s, the kind of man who had failed upward through a series of hospitality jobs until he landed somewhere. His accent made him exotic instead of ordinary. He had been at the Grand Hyatt for 6 years. In that time, he had learned exactly how much cruelty the position allowed him, and he used every inch of it. Drake. He said her name like it was a stain on his clipboard. Table 8 needs a refill. Why are you hiding back here? I'm not hiding. I'm rotating trays. You're avoiding the floor. She was not avoiding the floor. She was following the rotation schedule he had posted that morning. But Derek Whitmore did not want accuracy. He wanted submission. Yes, sir, she said. Table 8. She picked up a fresh bottle of the 2019 Margot and walked back into the ballroom. The man from table 14 was standing now, speaking quietly with an older woman in gray silk. Selma registered him in her peripheral vision the way she registered all potential obstacles, then dismissed him and moved toward table 8. The guest at table 8 was a hedge fund manager from Hong Kong, 63 years old, with a watch that cost more than Selma's apartment. He was telling a story about a yacht. The woman beside him was laughing too loudly. Selma approached from his left, angled the bottle toward his glass, and began to pour. She would replay what happened next for months. The way the man's elbow came up without warning as he gestured toward his companion. The way the bottle caught the edge of his sleeve and twisted in her grip. The wine, dark and expensive, arcing across the white tablecloth and onto the front of his jacket. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in waves, table by table, as heads turned toward the spreading stain. The man from table 14 stopped mid-sentence. His eyes found Selma's across the room, and for a moment she saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. What the hell? The hedge fund manager said, his voice carrying. What the hell is wrong with you? I'm so sorry, sir. Selma's hands were already moving, reaching for napkins, trying to contain the damage. Let me help you. I can... Don't touch me. He pulled back from her like she was contagious. Don't touch me. Where's the manager? Where the hell is the manager? Derek Whitmore appeared at Selma's elbow in under 30 seconds. He must have been watching for exactly this moment, waiting for her to fail in a way he could use. Sir, I am so deeply sorry. His voice was butter and broken glass. This is completely unacceptable. I can assure you, your staff just ruined a $4,000 jacket. And we will absolutely make this right, sir. If you'll allow me to arrange dry cleaning at our expense, and of course your meal this evening is complimentary. I don't want dry cleaning. I want to know why you have incompetent staff handling expensive wine in a room full of important people. Derek turned to look at Selma. His face was calm, almost regretful, but his eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like satisfaction. Miss Drake, he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Did you check the rotation schedule before approaching this table? I followed the schedule you posted this morning. That's not what I asked. Did you check it again before approaching with the wine? There was no need to check it again. I was following. So you admit you approached this table without verifying the current rotation. The room was watching now. 200 guests, 400,000 won a plate. And Selma Drake was the evening's entertainment. I followed your instructions exactly, she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything to keep it that way. My instructions were to provide attentive, careful service. Derek's voice carried perfectly, pitched for the audience he had always wanted. You've demonstrated tonight that you're incapable of meeting that standard. I'm afraid we'll have to let you go. You're firing me. For an accident. I'm protecting our guests from further incidents. His elbow hit my arm. If you look at the footage, Miss Drake. Derek stepped closer, dropping his voice just enough that only she and the nearest tables could hear. Do you really want to make a scene? Do you really want these people to remember your face? And there it was. The threat underneath the performance. Derek Whitmore knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to know that Selma Drake had reasons to stay invisible. She felt the room pressing in on her. The weight of 200 stares, the smell of wine and lamb, and her own humiliation. 11 years of careful anonymity, and she was about to become memorable for all the wrong reasons. No, she said quietly, I don't. Then I suggest you collect your things and leave through the service entrance. Your final check will be mailed. Selma set down the bottle. She untied her apron with hands that did not shake, because she had trained herself out of shaking a long time ago. She turned and walked toward the service corridor, keeping her spine straight and her eyes forward. She did not look at the man from table 14, but he looked at her. He watched her cross the ballroom with the kind of attention he usually reserved for provenance documents and shipping manifests. He noted the way she moved, controlled, and economical even in retreat. He noted the way her hands stayed loose at her sides when most people would have clenched them into fists. He noted most of all the moment she passed through the service doors and paused just inside the corridor. Just for a second. Just long enough to press her palm flat against the wall and breathe. Wonwoo Yoo was 25 years old. He had inherited his father's company at 19 and spent the next 6 years turning it into something his father never imagined. He moved art for people who preferred their collections undocumented. He kept secrets that could dismantle fortunes. He had learned, early, to read people the way other men read balance sheets. And the woman who had just been humiliated in front of 200 donors was not a banquet server. She was something else entirely, something pretending to be small. He excused himself from his conversation with the elderly donor and made his way toward the service corridor. Not quickly, never quickly. Wonwoo Yoo had learned that powerful men moved slowly, because they could afford to. He pushed through the service doors and found her standing exactly where he had expected, her back against the wall, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently, counting backward, he realized, from 60. He waited until she reached 42 before he spoke. That wasn't your fault. Her eyes opened. She did not startle, which told him more than her face did. No, she said. It wasn't. Derek Whitmore has been looking for a reason to fire someone publicly for 3 months. You were convenient. You know Derek? I know the type. Men who need an audience to feel powerful. He stepped closer, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. You're not going to fight it. It was not a question. No, Selma said. I'm not. Why not? She looked at him for a long moment, taking his measure the way he had taken hers. He could feel her attention like a physical weight, careful and thorough. Because I don't want these people to remember my face, she said finally. And you already know that, or you wouldn't have followed me back here. Wonwoo Yoo smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 11 days, and it felt strange on his face, like a muscle he had forgotten how to use. My name is Wonwoo Yoo, he said. I run a shipping company. I know who you are. She pushed off the wall and reached for her coat. You're the man who's been turning that water glass for the last hour instead of drinking from it. You're the man who sat through a conversation about tariffs without saying a single word. And you're the man who just watched me get fired and followed me into a service corridor instead of going back to your table. What does that tell you about me? Selma Drake looked at him with eyes that had seen things he could not yet imagine. It tells me, she said, that you're looking for something, and you think I might know where to find it. She walked past him toward the exit. He did not stop her. But he memorized the way she moved, and the steadiness of her hands, and the exact cadence of her voice when she said the word looking. 3 weeks later, he would find her again in Gyeongju, standing over a bucket of fresh mackerel at 6 in the morning, and she would not be surprised to see him at all. The fish market in Gyeongju opened at 4 in the morning, but Selma arrived at 5:30 when the crowds had thinned enough that she could move without brushing shoulders with strangers. She had learned, in the 3 weeks since the banquet, that anonymity required timing. The wrong hour meant too many eyes. The right hour meant becoming part of the landscape. Unremarkable. Forgettable. She was standing over a bucket of fresh mackerel when Wonwoo Yoo appeared at the edge of her vision. He was wearing a wool coat that cost more than 3 months of her rent, and he was holding a paper cup of something that steamed in the cold air. He did not approach immediately. He stood 6 feet away, watching her the way she had seen him watch the guests at that banquet, with the patience of someone who understood that information revealed itself to those who waited. "You found me," she said without turning around. "You weren't hiding." "I wasn't advertising either. No." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell coffee and something else underneath it. Cedar, maybe, or sandalwood. "You were buying fish at a market 2 hours from Seoul on a Wednesday morning. That's not hiding. That's establishing a pattern." Selma picked up a mackerel by the tail and examined it. The scales caught the light from the overhead bulbs, iridescent and cold. "Why are you here, Wonwoo Yoo?" "I have business in Gyeongju." "Art business? Shipping business?" He took a sip from his cup. "A client in the area is preparing for a memorial ceremony next month. His family's ancestral tablets need to be transported from storage to the ceremonial hall. The pieces are 300 years old. They require careful handling." "And you handle them yourself?" "I oversee. The actual crating is done by specialists." Something flickered across his face when he said the word crating, a tightness around the eyes that lasted less than a second. Selma filed it away without comment. "That doesn't explain why you're standing next to me in a fish market at 5:30 in the morning." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He did not offer an explanation. He simply stood there, holding his coffee, watching her select fish with the same careful attention he had shown her in the service corridor 3 weeks ago. That became the pattern over the next several days. Selma would arrive at the market. Wonwoo would appear somewhere nearby, never too close, never intrusive. He would watch. She would pretend not to notice. Eventually, one of them would speak, and the conversation would circle around the things neither of them was saying. On the 4th day, he brought her coffee. "You don't sleep much," he said, handing her the cup. "Neither do you." "I have reasons." "So do I." She took the coffee. Their fingers did not touch. She had the sense that he had calculated the exact distance required to avoid contact, and she was not sure whether to find that thoughtful or unsettling. "Derek Whitmore has been making calls," Wonwoo said. "Hotels in the city, catering companies, event coordinators." Selma's hand tightened on the cup. "How do you know that?" "I know people who know things." "What kind of things?" "The kind that matter." He turned to face her fully, and she realized for the first time how tall he was. 6 feet, maybe 6'1", young enough to still be growing into his power, old enough to know how to use it. He's telling them you're unreliable, that you caused a scene at the Hwang Foundation event, that you can't be trusted with high-value clients. He's blacklisting me. He's protecting himself. You embarrassed him by not fighting back. That made him look like a bully instead of a manager. Now he needs to justify what he did by making sure no one else will hire you. Selma stared at the steam rising from her coffee. She had worked 47 banquets in 4 months. She had been careful, professional, invisible. And now one man's wounded pride was going to erase all of it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you should know what you're dealing with." "That's not an answer." Wonwoo was quiet for a long moment. Behind them, the market sounds continued, vendors calling out prices, the wet slap of fish on ice, the rattle of carts over uneven concrete. "I watched you count backward from 60 in that corridor," he said finally. "Most people would have cried, or screamed, or walked out and never looked back. You counted backward from 60, and then you put your spine straight and walked out like you were leaving on your own terms. That's what you do when you can't afford to fall apart." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "It is." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his face she recognized. The careful blankness that came from years of practice. The stillness that said there were things underneath that could not be allowed to surface. "What are you running from, Wonwoo Yoo?" "The same thing you are." He finished his coffee and crumpled the cup in his hand. "The past." He left before she could ask what he meant. She watched him walk away through the market stalls, his coat dark against the morning light, and she did not follow. But she thought about him for the rest of the day. The call from Derek Whitmore came on the 6th day. Selma was in her rented room on the outskirts of Gyeongju, a small space with a single window that looked out over a parking lot. She had been there for 2 weeks, long enough to establish residency, but not long enough to feel at home. Home was a concept she had abandoned a long time ago. Her phone rang at 7 in the evening. The number was blocked. "Miss Drake?" Derek's voice was smooth and professional, the same voice he had used to fire her in front of 200 guests. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "What do you want?" "Just a friendly conversation. I've been hearing some interesting things about you, Selma. About your past. About the name you were using before you became a solar panel installer in Atlanta." Her blood went cold. She kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't, but here's the thing. I have friends in Seoul. Friends who do background checks for a living. And when I asked them to look into the woman who ruined a $4,000 jacket at the Hwang Foundation banquet, they found some very interesting gaps in your employment history." "Gaps aren't illegal." "No, but they are curious." She could hear him smiling. 11 years as a solar panel installer. Before that, nothing. No college records, no previous employment, no social media presence. It's like you didn't exist before 2014. Some people prefer privacy. Some people have something to hide. His voice dropped, losing the professional polish. "I don't know what you're hiding yet, Selma, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'm going to make sure everyone in Seoul knows about it. Every hotel, every catering company, every event coordinator. You'll never work in this city again." "Why?" The word came out harder than she intended. "Why do you care this much? I'm nobody. I poured wine at your banquet and made a mistake. Why does that warrant this kind of attention?" "Because you made me look bad." His voice was vicious now, stripped of pretense. "Because you stood there with that look on your face like you were better than me, like you were tolerating me. I've spent 6 years building my reputation at that hotel. 6 years. And you almost ruined it with 1 glass of wine and your goddamn attitude." "I didn't have an attitude. I followed your instructions exactly." "You followed them wrong. You made me look like a bully in front of donors who write checks with more zeros than you'll ever see. And now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." He hung up before she could respond. Selma sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at the phone in her hand. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Derek Whitmore was going to find out who she really was. It was only a matter of time. The gaps in her employment history led to witness protection, and witness protection led to her father, and her father led to everything she had spent 11 years trying to escape. Federal Judge Marcus Drake. Assassinated in his chambers 14 years ago for a ruling that threatened the wrong people. His daughter, 17 years old at the time, had been placed in witness protection and given a new name, a new city, a new life. Selma Drake was not the name she had been born with, but it was the name she had chosen, and she had built an entire identity around it, carefully, methodically, the way she calibrated angles on rooftops in Georgia heat. Now Derek Whitmore was going to tear it all down because she had not cried when he fired her. She thought about running. She had done it before, packed a bag, and disappeared to a new city with a new job and a new version of herself. Atlanta to Seoul, Seoul to Gyeongju, Gyeongju to somewhere else, anywhere else, as long as it was far enough away that the past could not find her. But she was tired of running. She was 35 years old, and she had been running since she was 17, and she did not know how much longer she could keep moving before she simply stopped existing altogether. Her phone buzzed. A text message from a number she did not recognize. The memorial ceremony I mentioned, my client's family, his name is Park Sung-ho. His grandfather was a judge. Selma stared at the message for a long time. Another text came through. I think you should come to the ceremony. I think there's something there you need to see. She did not respond, but she saved the number. The next morning, Wonwoo was waiting at her usual spot in the fish market. He looked like he had not slept, dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. You got my messages, he said. Yes. Will you come? To a stranger's memorial ceremony? Why would I do that? Because Park Sung-ho's grandfather was assassinated 31 years ago, shot in his chambers by someone who disagreed with a ruling. Wonwoo's voice was very quiet. The case was never solved. The family has spent 3 decades trying to find answers. Selma felt the ground shift under her feet. Why are you telling me this? Because I know who your father was. He met her eyes, and there was no calculation there now, only something that looked almost like compassion. I've known since the night of the banquet, the way you counted backward from 60, the way you kept your hands still when everyone else would have been shaking. I've seen that training before. I know what it means. What do you think it means? It means you learn to survive something most people can't imagine. And I think the people who killed your father used the same playbook as the people who killed Judge Park's grandfather. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded photograph. This was taken at the Park family's last memorial ceremony. Look at the man standing in the back row. Selma took the photograph. It showed a formal gathering, rows of people in traditional mourning clothes, a ceremonial table laden with offerings. In the back row, half hidden by the crowd, stood a man she recognized, Derek Whitmore. He was there, she said. Why was he there? That's what I'm trying to find out. Wonwoo took the photograph back and tucked it into his coat. The memorial ceremony for Judge Park's grandfather is in 4 weeks. Derek Whitmore will be there again. And I think, when you see what happens during the ritual, you'll understand why he's so desperate to keep you quiet. Selma looked at the young man standing in front of her, with his expensive coat and his careful stillness and his eyes that saw too much. She thought about running again. She thought about disappearing into another city, another name, another version of herself. But she was tired of being afraid. 4 weeks, she said. I'll be there. Wonwoo Yoo smiled for the second time since she had known him. It was a small smile, barely more than a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was real. Good, he said, because I think you're the only one who can stop what's coming. The ancestral hall smelled of incense and old wood. 300 guests knelt on cushions arranged in precise rows, their heads bowed as the officiant chanted prayers that had not changed in 4 centuries. At the front of the room, Park Sung-ho stood before the memorial tablets of his grandfather, his hands folded, his face still with the particular grief of someone mourning a death that had never been properly avenged. Selma Drake knelt in the 3rd row, wearing borrowed mourning clothes that did not quite fit. She had been in Gyeongju for 6 weeks now, long enough to learn the rhythms of the Park family's grief, long enough to understand why Wonwoo Yoo had brought her here. Derek Whitmore stood at the back of the hall, near the doors. He was wearing a dark suit that did not match the traditional garments around him, and he was watching the proceedings with the careful attention of a man who had something to protect. Selma had spent 14 years learning to recognize that look. She had seen it on the faces of the men who came to her father's chambers in the weeks before his death. The men who smiled and spoke politely and left threats underneath their formal language like knives hidden in silk. The officiant's voice rose, calling the ancestors to receive the offerings. Rice, wine, and fruit and carefully prepared dishes laid out on tables that gleamed in the candlelight. The room was silent except for the chanting, 300 people holding their breath in collective reverence. Wonwoo Yoo knelt 2 rows ahead of Selma. He had not looked at her since the ceremony began. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands stayed flat against his thighs instead of folded in prayer. He was waiting for something. The officiant paused. The silence stretched. And then Park Sung-ho stepped forward and lifted a document from the ancestral table. "My grandfather was murdered 31 years ago," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall with the clarity of a man who had practiced these words. He was a judge. He made a ruling that threatened powerful interests. And someone decided that ruling was worth more than his life. The room stirred. This was not part of the traditional ceremony. Selma could see confusion on the faces around her, elders exchanging glances, younger family members shifting on their cushions. "For 31 years, my family has sought justice. We have filed petitions, hired investigators, appealed to every authority we could find. And for 31 years, we have been blocked at every turn." Park Sung-ho turned to face the assembled guests. "Until now." He held up the document. "This is a shipping manifest dated 3 days before my grandfather's assassination. It records the transport of a crate from Seoul to the village where my grandfather was staying. The crate was listed as containing art supplies. It actually contained the weapon that was used to kill him." The room went very still. The shipping company that transported that crate was called Yoo Logistics. It was owned by the father of the man kneeling in the 3rd row. Park Sung-ho's eyes found Wonwoo's. Wonwoo Yoo inherited that company 6 years ago, and he has spent the last 3 years helping me trace the original shipment back to its source. Selma watched Wonwoo rise slowly to his feet. His face was calm, but she could see the cost of that calm in the way he held his body, controlled and rigid. "My father did not know what was in that crate," Wonwoo said. "But he should have asked. He should have looked. He chose not to, because the money was good and the client was powerful." He paused, letting the words settle. "I cannot undo what my father did, but I can tell you who ordered the shipment." He turned to look at the back of the room. Derek Whitmore was already moving toward the door. The man leaving this ceremony worked for a consulting firm in Seoul during the 1990s. That firm specialized in what they called reputation management. What they actually did was intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, and arrange for problems to disappear. Wonwoo's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Derek Whitmore was 23 years old when he coordinated the logistics of Judge Park's assassination. He has spent the last 3 decades moving between positions that gave him access to powerful people and vulnerable targets. He is currently employed as a banquet manager at the Grand Hyatt Seoul, where he continues to identify and silence anyone who might threaten his client's interests. Derek froze at the door. Every eye in the room was on him now. "This is insane." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of Judge Park. I've never worked for any consulting firm. You attended the Park family's memorial ceremony 2 years ago." Wonwoo reached into his coat and produced the photograph Selma had seen in the fish market. "You stood in the back row, just as you're standing now. You came to make sure the family had not discovered anything new. You came to monitor their progress." "That proves nothing. Anyone can attend a public ceremony." "You're right." Wonwoo's voice was very quiet. "That photograph alone proves nothing. But combined with the shipping manifests, the financial records, and the testimony of 3 witnesses who worked with you at the consulting firm, it establishes a pattern that the Korean National Police have found very interesting. Derek's face went pale. Selma rose to her feet. She had not planned to speak. She had come to observe, to understand, to see the playbook that had destroyed her own family deployed against another. But watching Derek Whitmore cornered in a room full of witnesses, watching Wonwoo systematically dismantle the man who had humiliated her in front of 200 donors, she felt something shift in her chest. This was not justice. This was exposure. And there was a difference. "Stop," she said. The room turned to look at her. Wonwoo's eyes found hers, and she saw surprise there, and something else. Concern. "This man destroyed my career," Selma said. "He fired me in front of a room full of wealthy guests because a donor's elbow hit my arm. He called every hotel and catering company in Seoul to make sure I would never work in this city again. And for the last 6 weeks, he has been investigating my past, looking for something he could use to silence me." She walked forward, through the rows of kneeling guests, until she stood in the center of the hall. "My father was Judge Marcus Drake. He was assassinated in his chambers 14 years ago for a ruling that threatened powerful interests. The same playbook, the same pattern: intimidation, isolation, and then elimination." She looked at Derek, and her voice did not waver. "I recognize you now. Not your face, your methods, the way you identify targets, the way you separate them from anyone who might help, the way you destroy their credibility before they even know they're being hunted." Derek's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with this dramatic performance, but I'm not accomplishing anything." Selma cut him off, her voice still calm. "That's not why I'm speaking. I could stand here and tell everyone what you did to me. I could describe the phone call you made to my rented room, the threats, the promise that you would dig until you found something worth using. I could expose every detail of your petty cruelty and let this room decide what to do with you." She paused. "But that's not what I want." The room was utterly silent. "I want you arrested by Korean authorities and tried in a Korean court. I want the evidence Wonwoo has gathered submitted through proper legal channels. I want Judge Park's family to have a verdict, not a spectacle." Her eyes held Derek's. "And I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that the woman you tried to destroy chose dignity over revenge. That she had the power to humiliate you the way you humiliated her, and she refused to take it." Derek's face twisted. "You don't have the authority to." "She has my authority." Park Sung-ho stepped forward, his voice quiet but absolute. "This is my family's ceremony, my grandfather's memorial, and I am choosing to honor his memory the way he would have wanted. Through the law, through proper procedure. Through the same courts he dedicated his life to serving." He nodded to 2 men standing near the side entrance. They wore dark suits and the controlled expressions of law enforcement. "Detective Kim, Detective Cho, you have the documentation we discussed. Please escort Mr. Whitmore to the Gyeongju police station. He will be held pending transfer to Seoul and formal charges." Derek Whitmore did not struggle as the detectives approached. He simply stood there, pale and diminished, watching Selma Drake with an expression she could not quite name. Hatred, maybe. Or something closer to confusion. He had expected her to destroy him. He had prepared for rage and public humiliation, and the kind of scorched earth revenge that powerful people used against each other. He had not prepared for restraint. The detectives led him out through the side door. The room remained silent long after he was gone. Selma turned to look at Wonwoo. He was watching her with that same careful attention he had shown in the service corridor 6 weeks ago, that first night when she had counted backward from 60 instead of falling apart. "You could have let me handle it," he said quietly. "You would have destroyed him." "Yes, that's not what I needed." She held his gaze. "I needed him to know that I chose not to, that the choice was mine." Wonwoo Yoo smiled for the 3rd time since she had known him. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it reached his eyes in a way the others had not. "I know," he said. "That's why I brought you here." The ancestral hall emptied slowly. Guests filed out in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, processing what they had witnessed. Park Sung-ho remained at the front of the room for a long time, his hand resting on his grandfather's memorial tablet, his lips moving in a prayer Selma could not hear. She waited by the side entrance, watching the candles burn low. Wonwoo found her there 20 minutes later. He had shed his formal jacket somewhere, and he looked younger without it, less armored. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for 6 weeks was gone. "The police called," he said. "Derek's being transferred to Seoul tonight. The prosecutor thinks the case is strong enough to move forward." "Good. You don't sound satisfied." "Satisfaction isn't what I was looking for." She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since the banquet, she let herself really see him. The careful stillness that masked something fragile. The way he held himself at a distance even when he was standing close. "You knew I would stop you. That's why you brought me here instead of handling it yourself." "I knew you would make the choice that mattered. I didn't know which one it would be." "Yes, you did." Her voice was gentle. "You've been reading me since the night we met. You knew I wouldn't take the revenge. You knew I would want justice instead." Wonwoo was quiet for a moment. Quiet. Outside, she could hear car doors closing, engines starting, the slow dispersal of 300 witnesses to something that would be talked about for years. "I knew what I hoped you would choose," he said finally. "That's not the same thing. It's close enough." She reached out and touched his hand. Just briefly. Just enough to feel the warmth of his skin and the slight tremor underneath it. "You can't go into your own crating warehouse," she said quietly. "I've watched you for 6 weeks. You walk to the door and stop. You send your staff in ahead of you. You find reasons to be somewhere else when the actual packing happens." His face went very still. "I was smuggled out of Seoul in a shipping crate when I was 7 years old," he said. "My father's business associates decided he had become a liability. They came to our house in the middle of the night. The only way to get me out was to hide me in the inventory already loaded for transport." He paused. "I was in that crate for 11 hours. It was dark. I couldn't move. I could hear men searching the warehouse, calling my father's name, and I learned that small spaces are not safe. They are coffins waiting to close." "But you still run the company. Someone has to make sure it does something good. Something that matters." His eyes met hers. "That's what you taught me. Standing in that hall tonight. Choosing the harder path because it was the right one." Selma looked at this man who had found her in a service corridor and followed her to a fish market and brought her to a ceremony that changed everything. 25 years old, already carrying decades of weight, still learning how to put it down. "Come to Atlanta with me," she said, "when this is over, when the trial is finished and Derek is sentenced and you don't have to carry this anymore. Come see where I learned to install solar panels. Come meet the city that taught me how to rebuild." Wonwoo Yoo smiled, not the small, controlled smile she had seen 3 times before, a real smile, full and open, the kind that changed his entire face. "Yes," he said, "I will." She had learned that justice was not the same as vengeance. She had learned that dignity was its own kind of power. She had learned that the people who see you most clearly are sometimes the ones you least expect. And she had learned, finally, that running was not the only way to survive. Sometimes you stood still. Sometimes you let yourself be found. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me which moment changed how you saw Selma. It genuinely means something to know this reached the right person. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, and I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one.